Welcome everybody. My name is Stellan Windhagen. I am Director of the Resistance Studies Initiative. And we are having every fall a speaker series with a lot of different interesting topics. And Mandy, that is visiting us here today, she was here already in October.
Oh, October.
Yeah. And then she was talking about the challenges of how it can be difficult to have intersectional resistance alliances. This time she's going to talk about best practices or models of how we could collaborate across different identity groups in creating resistance alliances. So it's in that way, it's a follow-up from the last talk. But if you weren't at the first one, no problem. You go directly to the solutions.
Yes. I'll give you an encapsulated kind of like what we talked a little bit about.
So I want to highlight some things. We have a mailing list. Please sign up on that one if you want to know about our different events. We promise to only send stuff that is relevant to resistance studies. We have different kinds of events, and one of the events that is coming up on Monday is a book launch party at Amherst Books with this book being presented that I wrote together with a colleague in Sweden about an ignored form of resistance that is very interesting, everyday resistance, where people in their everyday life in families, workplaces, or schools are participating in resistance, but it's not done in the typical way through having banners and shouting claims and demands to people, but you're kind of doing it in a more, I would say, covert or hidden way, creative way, where people are finding ways of cutting corners. So, if you want to know more about that, that's on Monday at 7 at Amherst Books.
Amherst Books.
Right, and then also the Resistance Studies Initiative is publishing 2 times a year the Journal of Resistance Studies. And that's a unique journal that is focusing on understanding resistance of different kind. We have free copies there if you're interested to learn about it. Just spread it to others. People get to know that there exists such a journal. And you can also then submit book reviews or articles to it. We have a website where you can get to know more about that. Welcome. And then lastly, there are some snacks over there.
Yeah,
if you want some fruit or some cookies, free to take. Hi.
Yep. Hi,
All
come
right.
on in.
So with that, I want to really say super welcome to Mandy Carter here again. It's a pleasure to have you here, and we had some time to discuss things also today. And we are in the Resistance Studies Initiative focusing quite much on this topic, so it's a topic of dear interest for us. From the Resistance Studies Initiative, here is also Joanne Sheehan,
another fellow,
friend of Mandy. They've known each other since you were
in our early 20s.
Early 20s, right.
19, 20.
We won't say how old you are now.
Oh, won't it?
But it was a couple of years ago. Yeah. All right, Mandy, welcome.
Thank you. All right, thank you so much. Just out of curiosity, was anyone here when I did my talk in September or October? All right, so you might hear some of the same things again, but just go, glad to hear it again. First of all, I want to say thank you to UMass Amherst Resistance Studies Initiative. Also, Debbie, thank you for the logistical stuff and your support, and Stellan, and of course, Joanne is now a fellow as well. I will introduce myself by saying my name is Mandy Carter. I go by the pronouns she, her, hers. I self-identify as a Southern out Black lesbian social justice activist, and now going into my 52nd year of organizing because that's what I do. But today I thought what would be good to talk a little bit about where we are. Literally, I have 4 examples when we think about nonviolence resistance or what's happening in the world today. But also some interesting things. I'm bringing greetings from North Carolina. That's where I live, and that's where I'm coming from. But there's been some recent developments that have happened in North Carolina that have national implications, But then I think there's some other people around the room, Peggy Mish and Joanne, who I've known for a while, they've talked about some other issues and tactics and campaigns that we've had done in the past, and talking about how relevant is that today. But I also want to talk about this reality check about college campuses and activism, and how oftentimes those two movements have been intricately connected for, I would say, decades and decades and decades. And what does that mean now in terms of 2019 going forward? But what about lessons from the past as well? So I'm going to try to do like four examples. One would be just telling you a little bit about how did you get to be at this table? How do we end up being activists? What are our journeys about why we are where we are and what we decide to do with it maybe 10 or 20 years later, but just how we got into this room. I want to share a little bit about that in terms of my background. But then I want to talk about a couple of circumstances in terms of the 1960s, that there's this whole kind of generational, what we call the baby boomers. There's about, like we're in our 70s now, but there's roughly about 75 million baby boomers born between post-World War II, 1946 to 1964. But anyone in the room who's between the ages of 18 and 35, if you feel comfortable, could you just raise your hand and acknowledge? There's going to be about 75 million of you right now. I can count. And if we're talking about this intentional multi-generational conversation, multi-generational activism, this would be an interesting time to have that conversation. To give you an idea, I'm looking at Joanne Sheehan. We met through the Warrior Sisters League. Recently, we were having some meetings, and there was a little baby called Patrick Gomer Sheehan. Patrick is now grown up, got married, has their own children. And I'm sitting here thinking, did we have any idea when we were getting involved in our movement activism about that kind of a generational spread of what's happening? But this intentional generational baby boomers, I don't know what word you want to call the 18 to 35-year-olds, but that's a moment to think about how we can tap into that. I'd like to share a little bit about that. And then I want to talk to you about the little package you have in front of you. The little purple, it has a purple about vote, the thing about been locked up and whether or not you still have a right to vote. And then I bought you a wonderful little tag of our organization called Equality North Carolina. That's another piece that I'll talk about, what that means about the right to vote in jail. We got big elections coming up. But then I want to talk about, when I made my other little list, a group called Southerners on New Ground. And I'll tell you a little bit about what that organization is. It's now going to be in its 30th year in a couple of years. But what that organization started out to be, the intentionality of it, and why we're still going 30 years later. And some of it has directly related to what you have in front of you in terms of those packets. And then there's that little thing called the 100th anniversary of the women's right to vote that will happen in 2020. 100 years ago, when you think about that journey. And I can't call it a celebration because there was some drama and trauma around how women had to fight for the right to vote. And then what happened in Seneca Falls, lessons learned from there, implications of that. But what do we do with the 100th commemoration of the right to vote? And then there's a little thing called the Equal Rights Amendment, ERA. ERA, we're now only 1 or 2 states away from figuring out we can actually pass the Equal Rights Amendment. That could happen next year. And there's a little conversation about what we do about that right now. Is anyone here from the state of Virginia? Has anyone driven through the state of Virginia? You all know where it is, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you saw what just happened. It wasn't just a blue wave, it was a blue juggernaut in terms of the state of Virginia. But when you have a state that says we want to support the Equal Rights Amendment, that's one more state. And what's the next state down below Virginia? North Carolina. And that's exactly what we're trying to do as well. So there's that little conversation about the ERA. I'm only going to talk about 45 minutes because I like to leave a full hour for Q&A, discussions, what the heck, Mandy, what's going on, whatever it might be. So it's more of our conversation, and it's very informal. No, you have to raise your hand or nothing like that. It's just more of a, how do we continue this conversation? I get to go back home to North Carolina tomorrow on a flight. I think it's going to get me back home. But you're all still here. And then how many freshmen, just real quick, how many freshmen in the room? How many sophomore, juniors, seniors? And you all seniors know what you're going to do when you leave here? I don't know, I'm just curious, but it's just getting a sense. And any community members in the room? Any other folks in the local community around or some? Yeah, because that's that interesting conversation. What do you do when you have a community and there's the community, then there's the campus? And like Amherst, I'm in Durham. There's Duke University really nearby. There's North Carolina Central University, one of the 11 historically black colleges in North Carolina, and the impact that can have on each other, the campus and the community. But understanding that's part of what I love about UMass Amherst having this Resistance Studies initiative, but what that means as well. So that's just an hour, just a conversation, talk, whatever it might be. And we'll end at 6. And I think I'm going over to the Stonewall Center after for the, there's like a meal or something that's going to happen to 6 to 8 that I'll go right there after as well. So we good? All right. I'm going to start a little bit of notes, and please be patient with me if that's okay. So I already said thank you for attending this very informal conversation and discussion. Talk about 45 minutes. And I want to just start by doing a little brief background on, Randy, a little brief background on who I am. So my name is Mandy Carter. I was born November 2nd, 1948. That's part of the baby boomer thing. But because of life and circumstance, my brother Ronnie, who's 1 year older than me, and my sister Dolores, our mother got up one day and never came back. So we became wards of the state of New York. And so for the first few years, we were in a kind of basically a home for unwanted babies. And this is in Albany, New York. But when we got of age, right up the street is the Albany Children's Home. And we were there to the age of 8. Ronnie was 9, my sister Dolores was 10. The home got sold. It is now Russell Sage Junior College. But when the home got sold, they had to figure out where all these children that were sitting in this children's home were going to go. And it had very few children of color. And so good luck, good fortune, however you want to say it, there was a black foster farm family in Chatham Center, New York, not that far from Albany, New York. This black foster family took me, Ronnie, and Dolores into their foster home. And that was until I was 12 years old. Without getting into much detail, unfortunately, when I turned 12, I was there with Ronnie, my sister Dolores, I was there. All of a sudden, Dolores was gone, not Dolores 8, 9, or 10, and she ended up being sent to the Schenectady Children's Home, which is not that far from Albany. And then so it was just me and Ronnie. But then something interesting happened. All of a sudden, I was also being told, Mandy, I don't think it's going to work out for you to be in this foster home in Chatham Center. I got sent to the Schenectady Children's Home as well. And that's where I spent from the ages of 12 to 18. If you know the whole system, if you're not adopted in the foster care and or children's home society, you age out at 18. You're on your own. You're basically on your own. So to make a long story short, when I aged out at 18, only because, this is the most important part, in the Schenectady Children's Home, they had the option to send everyone to a public school. We got sent to Mount Pleasant High School, walking distance from where the children's home was. And because of that, going to that Mount Pleasant High School, there was my social studies teacher. I'm in the class of 1966. My social studies teacher, Jack Hickey, brought someone in from a group I had never heard of before, the American Friends Service Committee, Quakers, right. That one 40-minute class, literally, he said 3 things, and why I'm sitting here before you now. The first thing he said, well, the American Society, what's the Religious Society of Friends, basically full equality and justice for all. Remember, this is 64, 65, 66, predominantly white peace group, but they were also talking about full equality and justice for all, and how they, as the Quakers, were trying to figure out how they could be allies to the ever-growing black civil rights movement down south. So that was sort of the conversation that he also had. So that first thing was the Quakers and what they believe in, the fact that they, as allies, they wanted to know how they could be a part of the growing civil rights movement. But the third thing he said, there was 4 things. The third thing he said, he talked about the concept of power of one. And I remember him thinking, when I heard that, I thought, well, what does that mean? He basically said, and I believe this, each and every one of us has the potential to impact change if we so choose to act on it. Each and every one of us has the potential to impact change if we so choose to, do something with it. And I remember thinking, well, whatever. But it was the 4th thing. We have a high school work camp in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania who would like to go. I raised my hand. That was the game-changing moment of why I'm sitting before you right today. Because getting the permission from the children's home to go to this work camp, which basically, has anyone ever been to camp? It's like you have bunk beds and you have meals and whatever. I mean, maybe there was maybe 12 of us. And I was 15 or 16, junior in college. But who they bought, high school, but who they bought into that as resource people, that was really what changed. It's like if you were to read any book, but if you have sitting in front of you a white folk singing couple called Guy and Candy Carowin from a group called the Highlander Center, which I had never heard of before, and they called themselves Culture. And by the way, has anyone ever heard of the Highlander Center? Not familiar? Some of you have, all right. All right. The Highlander Center was started in the 30s in order to have intentionally black and white folk in Tennessee come together and talk about how they could use concepts of nonviolence to have direct impact on the civil rights movement, other movements, but intentionally from day one having black and white folks in the same space. It's sort of like they have like a big room, rocking chairs in it kind of, and having conversation. Well, the Klan came and burned that place to the ground. But Guy and Candy Carowin were from there, but the place is still open to this day. Even though it got burned to the ground, they rebuilt it, it's still there. But Guy and Candy Carowin, as white folk singers, talked about the challenge they had was, again, that was Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, Judy Collins, that whole kind of 60s era, and what else was happening besides the civil rights movement, the war in Vietnam. But when Guy and Candy Carowin then talked about who they are, Power of One, how they use music as a way to make change, and then they said, by the way, Joan Baez and Ira Sandpearl and Roy Kepler are going to open the Institute for the Study of Nonviolence. You ever find yourself out there in California, you ought to go. I went. It was just this unbelievable circumstance of how hearing that conversation, putting it in my mind, and then thinking about, I graduated from high school. I keep on forgetting that. Aced out at 18, and then miraculously ended up $85 in my pocket, go to New York City. That's, hippies and whatnot. And happened to be going by a building down in the west side of New York. And I had no money, ran out of money, but the building said, free lunch, come on in. It was called the League for Spiritual Discovery. It was run by who? Timothy Leary of LSD. And I got a job for the summer, being there. At the end of the summer, two friends of ours and me hitchhiked out to San Francisco, California in the summer of 1967. Anyone been in San Francisco? Kind of know where it is? You know where it is, right? Back in the day. Well, back in that day, you had thousands of people moving to San Francisco. It was like that, what was that song called? If you're coming to San Francisco, be sure to wear flowers in your hair. Scott McKenzie. We get to Haight-Ashbury, and it was wonderful. Then they have a thing called the Haight-Ashbury switchboard. The Haight-Ashbury switchboard had a Rolodex file, and it said, if anyone's coming from out of town, needs temporary housing, you can go ahead and pull a number and see if that person will put you up for a few days. The card that me, Natalia, and Toshi pulled was a person named Vincent O'Connor of the Catholic Peace Fellowship, 591 Waller Street. And because we ended up staying with Vincent O'Connor with the Catholic Peace Fellowship had been invited to the Institute for the Study of Nonviolence down in Carmel Valley to discuss what? One of the first nonviolent civil disobedience actions to sit in at the Oakland Induction Center in opposition to the war in Vietnam, because we had a draft at that time. So I get to go down to the Institute for the Study of Nonviolence and heard this conversation in 1967. Fast forward to 1969. By now, there was a lot of conversation about the war in Vietnam, what was going on, and there had been called for a national call for nonviolence, like resistance of the war in October. But the WRL wanted to do a nonviolent civil disobedience sit-in. Is anyone, you get in, you sit down, you kind of block the door, you get arrested, that kind of thing. That happened in October. But I decided to wait until December of '67. Then I went and got arrested at the Oakland Induction Center. And I ended up going to a jail called Santa Rita Jail, not far. I was the only woman of color arrested. I think there was like maybe 60 women who got arrested purposely, jail, no bail. And I was in jail one day, and this woman comes up to me. Her name was Jane Shulman, and says, Mandy Carter, have you ever heard of an organization called the War Resisters League? No? Mm-mm. Well, we're going to have a potluck. Would you like to come? And I said, well, what the hell's a potluck? I went to that potluck. That was in 1967. I ended up joining the staff of the War Resisters League in 1969. And one of the people that I met is right back in that back room, Randy Keeler. 50 years ago, Randy Keeler was on staff, and Randy was going off to jail for the war in Vietnam, and he was in it with David Harris and Christopher Jones. And because Randy went off to jail, hi Randy, I ended up getting a job with the War Resisters League, and we've held on to this calendar for 50 years and thinking about that. But I want to get to this conversation about the power of one. When that young person came into my high school and gave this rap, I'm sure he just said another rap, probably not having any impact on anyone's life. He had no idea the impact he had on mine. And I think when Randy gave a speech, and when you were giving a speech somewhere, there was another man in that audience who had an impact because of him, Daniel Ellsberg. Because of Randy, I'm sure when you give talks, and we all do it, but you never know in what time and circumstance, when you're having conversation, when you're just talking about who you are, you have no idea whose lives you might be impacted by. And so for that if I could find him, I would owe him a huge thank you. But that was the young man who came to my high school class. So Randy talks about, and I guess the Ellsberg papers are here now at UMass Amherst, but that conversation, whether you know Dan or not, I only raise that because when we think about how you have intentional intersectionality, best practices, what doesn't work, what does work, lessons learned, and then moving forward, what are we going to do with it collectively? That to me is just an example. I was 19, I'm now 71, I'll own it. But why am I still here? And yet here you are, and I hope that we can find some intentionality around why we have this thing about why we are still here, how we stay engaged, and then what do we do with it moving forward in terms of progressively thinking ahead. So that's why I want to share that. Randy, I'm so glad you walked in the room at the time you did, because that was going to be my point. What happened?
They sent him to
Integrated.
Oh. Did you have your GPS? So I just wanted to share that about 1969, but also putting in the context. And then let me ask you this question. I don't know. This is me, and you do it, Joanne, and other folks do it as well. Why are you here at this campus? What are your studies? And then what do you decide you want to do with it? If you already know coming in, I want to do this, I want to do that, whatever. But do you intentionally start out thinking this is what I want to do and it might change or not in terms of peace studies, black studies, women's studies, LGBT studies, whatever it might be. But what's the gift that you all have that however you want to utilize that in terms of equality and justice for all, health, food, language, where people live, and how you figure out what you might want to do with that, knowing that people have been involved in this movement for decades and decades and decades. But can we now share each other's experiences? Can we share each other's questions? And how can we actually literally going forward together, work together in terms of what we want to do? And that's why I want to just make that reference. And the fact that hang on to this damn calendar, which they don't even make anymore. And can I just do one thing? What's today? December 4th. Shall I tell you what I was doing on December 4th 50 years ago? I'll tell you, this is it. See how it's all messed up? All right. So here's what happened on December 4th, 50 years ago. Making up conference packet covers for a study kit that we did with the War Resisters League. Having a housing dinner 6 p.m. at Randy's house. Collating party at the War Resisters League office in San Francisco. And also on the 4th, Carol Swenson was going to jail because they just committed nonviolent civil disobedience around Biafra. And I'm thinking, well, gee whiz, and here we are, and here it is. But you mark it. So I'll leave that point right there. Just to repeat what I was thinking a little bit more about just the fact that you do what you do and you have no idea. But I think getting back to this notion about the power of one and whether or not, however we go about our daily lives and what we do and how we're active or not active in terms of people whatever, how that can actually do it. But if there's an intentionality about how you show up. So the fact that, this is to me, the fact that you have students going into high school classes, junior high school classes, going into elementary school. You now have story time for little children now. about when do you first get introduced about these concepts of equality and justice for all and what that might be, but what would be the circumstance? So the power of one means we all have the potential to make that happen. And it's against that backdrop I want to talk about how the power of one with some people that we got organized around an organization called Southerners on New Ground. Southerners on New Ground song, real quick. The reason why we had the organization that came out of this, there was going to be a conference down in Durham, North Carolina, essentially. And when people heard there was going to be a conference down in Durham, North Carolina, it was like it's called Creating Change. It's a gay LGBTQ and ally conference. It was held every year, Washington, D.C. They decided what would happen if we tried to do one down south in Durham, North Carolina. I was there with the Warrior Sisters League. It was held in 1993. Yes, 1993. And has anyone been down in North Carolina and knows anything about it? Well, you do, Jane, whatever. But it's not that far. But the first phone calls we got is, is there an airport down there we can go to even get to the conference that we're having? Yeah, it's like 10 minutes from downtown Durham. This is 1990. Why are we holding it in the state of North Carolina, the state of Republican Senator U.S. Jesse Helms, who was very anti-gay, but also very anti-people of color during the Civil Rights Movement? And we said we're holding it in the state of North Carolina precisely because he's in the state of North Carolina. Then we got sort of like, well, will we be able to eat regular food, and what are grits? I mean, the anti-Southern bias was just pretty astounding. But because of that, some of us who already knew each other, who were doing organizing in the South, all women, we all knew each other, all 3 black women, lesbian, 3 white Southern lesbians, got together and said, what if we ended up forming an organization that would really address this idea of living, organizing, being in the South as models of how you could make change in the South? And because we intentionally, and this is important, intentionally started out right from the very beginning, we had 3 white progressive Southern lesbians, self-identified, Suzanne Farr, Mab Segrist, Pam McMichael, Little Rock, Arkansas, Louisville, Kentucky, Durham, North Carolina. And then we had intentionally 3 black progressive lesbians, Mandy Carter, Durham, Joan Garner, Atlanta, Georgia, and Pat Hussein, Atlanta. And because we intentionally, from the very beginning, wanted to make sure we started out right from the get with that kind of a co-model, intentionally, that really made a difference, and that's why I think we're still here almost 30 years later. But we also then had this conversation about what's the mission, what's the purpose of Southerners on New, and by the way, the term Southerners on New Ground, it stands for what? Song. And we thought about Song of the South, cultural stuff, and so, song. We met, and then we had to do this conversation, and it might happen with other groups. What's the point of our organization? What are we trying to get done? And we had some meetings, and we had to figure this out. And this is initially what we decided in the very beginning. If we want to create transformative models of organizing in the South by Southerners that would connect, initially it was race, class, culture, gender, and sexual orientation. This is 1990. That's what we had at that time. But since then, we've added other isms, other kind of issues that we could talk about why we could be intentionally intersectional. Then we added things like food justice, language justice, accessibility in terms of disability rights. But we kept on making the list longer and longer, not because it got more complicated, but it really meant that we were beginning to understand just how much these two things are connected. And we're not only, like I am like black, I'm a lesbian, I'm 71, and I think about the fact that I can be, as a lesbian, I can be an ally now to the transgender movement, if you think about that. And so it's just how we might be connected, but how intentionally we decided to do that. So that original 6, now we have, that's transformed to some other board members are on it, other staff people are on it. But had we not decided that we would try this and see if this would work or not, now we're realizing it really does. So Southerners on New Ground started out to be a really grassroots, getting into people's homes, having conversations around coffee tables. What are the issues of the day? North Carolina has 100 counties. We literally got in the car and drove out to different parts of the counties. What's your issue? What are you involved in? How can we be a part of the conversation that you want to have? That was a model of how we also did the organizing. We didn't have any social media at the time. But fast forward to 2019. Can you just lift up this little packet a little bit for a minute? This is where we get into it. That journey from 1990, talking about these related connections, one of the things Song started to think about was who are the disenfranchised? Who are the ones left out and left behind? And then we started looking at who's sitting in those jails. And I remember, Randy, when we were sitting in Santa Rita, 99% of those women in the jail were women of color. I don't know about what on the men's side. Same thing. And you think about that. And what was interesting, they said, now Song had done everything from language, like for instance, language justice. Let's say we're having a meeting and you have someone who only speaks Spanish or doesn't speak Spanish. You might want to have someone that can interpret and or the information in Spanish as well. But one of the things they decided was when we look around Durham, North Carolina, the county, and we started looking at the disenfranchised, and we started thinking about who are the women that are sitting in those jails in Durham, North Carolina. And that's when they thought about, well, what if we start a Black Mamas Bailout Project? Black Mom, you can text it, you can Google it, but that was just a thought, and that's what I love, what if? And we said, well, what if we decided to go down to the Durham County Jail, find out who these women are, and why are they in there? Because they can't get out because there's cash bail. You can't afford to get out. And if you can't afford to get out, you have to stay there until your trial. That could be months, that could be weeks, that could be a year. And then someone said, well, then they're called Black Mom because they have family. And if they're sitting in jail, what about their children? What about their family? Then they began to make all these connections. Wait a minute. Maybe Southerners on New Ground is not only about the South, but about our local jails, who's sitting in them, and the impact it might have the women that are sitting in those jails and who's directly impacted. And then they said, well, maybe what we need to do, and this was an easy thing to begin with, if we can just get enough money pulled together, and they strategically thought about, we will bail out this many women on Mother's Day. Thinking about the interesting notion of a Mother's Day bailout. And at the first year, they bailed out 7 women. 7 women, they got them out, they had this amazing welcome and all that other stuff. And then they started asking these women, why are you here? What's your story with the background? And to make a long story short, that 7 became 14, that 14 became, and it kept on multiplying. And they realized in Durham County Jail, well, what if we do it in Durham County Jail? Could that be replicable in any county jail? And so when you see this thing about locked up, you still have the right to vote, then we begin to realize if they're sitting in jail, who are the people they're having a direct impact on? Well, it's a judge. Well, who elects the judge? It's the lawyers, or who are these lawyers? And also because there's if you have cash bail, who are the people sitting in Raleigh, their state capital? They begin to put 2 and 2 together, thought, not only do the women have a right to vote, if you're sitting in jail and you literally have a right to vote, you can absentee ballot, I think I mentioned this last time, but you still have the right to vote, but who's advocating for that? Who's coming into the jail to have that conversation? And so part of what Democracy in North Carolina put together was this little thing about if you're in jail, you have a right. What are the rights? Who's going to physically come into the jail for you and get you registered to vote? And then you get to have the right to vote. But then they said, vote for who? Then all of a sudden they were thinking about, well, we can have that vote be collectivized in terms of a city or county and understand the importance of the vote. And then Democracy in North Carolina said, well, maybe we need to put a pamphlet about how anyone has the right to vote. So that partnership between Southerners on New Ground and Democracy in North Carolina came out of this wonderful idea of a Black Mamas Bailout Project. There's now a partnership with that relationship. And so now you have how you vote, what you can do to vote. And then, of course, one of the groups that got pulled into it is the organization I work with, Equality in North Carolina. So that's 3 groups: Southerners on New Ground, Democracy in North Carolina, Equality in North Carolina. That's a partnership, and that exists to this day. And now we're replicating that in other county jails in other parts of the state of North Carolina. That's why that packet is so important to have in your hand. But then who gets into jail to have anyway, to make a long story short, that was like a journey of grassroots organizing. All we do is grassroots organizing. Just get into that whole notion about how change can happen. Hearts and minds. Remember, Guy and Candy Carowin, guitar, music. All of a sudden understanding about and the changing of public policy. And where does that happen? In the courts, in the voting booth. So it's almost like grassroots organizing, and now 27 years later, they decided they want to go all in, continuing with the grassroots organizing, but also adding this other dimension of politics, voting, the right to vote. Who has the right to vote? And then, this gets into my other conversation flowing into it. There was a time when women did not have the right to vote, and people of color didn't have the right to vote. Remember? I mean, if you remember back in the day, that used to be the case. When these lands first got settled, and there was a conversation about, we came here for whatever, what was the reason why we came here? To get away from whatever that was. We're going to set up our own society. And then when some men got together and wrote the Constitution and decided, well, but not you. No women had the right to vote. And we came as slaves, so, you know, that whole journey about slaves to citizenships, and we finally get to be citizens. But then when we got our full citizenship, we were told exactly with the women, but you can't vote either. And by default, if women can't vote and people of color can't vote, what you got left? Just being respectful. But then, don't mourn, organize. If there's a need, fill it. Some women said, well, I don't think this is right. I think we should do something about this. And then there's that whole journey about Seneca Falls. There was one of the first conventions of women coming together to strategize about how they were going to organize and mobilize to get the right to vote for women. But at that meeting in Seneca Falls, New York, they had a very important question to ask and answer. But do we include black women? And history will tell you they decided at that time, no, but we'll come back and get you later. And we have to live with that memory. Why? Why was that the decision? And a lot of it was just practical. We think practically speaking, if we can just get this first thing done, we can come back and get you later, then we'll all kind of be in the same kind of like, frame. But that was a very divisive, and even now going into the anniversary of the women's right, the commemoration, that's still a topic of conversation. We'll come back and get you later. And eventually it did happen. But why that? But it happened again in terms of the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. It only happened a few years ago. Similar situation. There was a whole idea about gays and lesbians having a right to have a job and not being discriminated against. Employment Non-Discrimination Act. But it meant for lesbians and gay men. And then someone said, well, what about the transgender community? No, we'll come back and get you later. Did we not learn this lesson in Seneca Falls? I just wonder how many times we repeat ourselves. But fortunately, at this time with the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, people said, no, if we don't have include everyone, we can't do everyone at all. But I just look back at that. And now, with the right to vote next year, then we also talk about this thing called the Equal Rights Amendment. So we get the right to vote, women get the right to vote, make a lot of differences and whatnot, but still, when you look at this little thing about the employment in terms of the Equal Rights Amendment, we still don't have all the regular rights that other people might have just based on gender. Remember how we talked about song, race, class, culture, gender, sexual orientation, identity, and that was consistent, so it meant we did more than just LGBTQ, more than just people of color. We did language justice, trying to be intentionally intersectional, but what would keep us all in the same conversation? And so the timing of the Equal Rights Amendment coming up in 2020, along with the anniversary of the right to women having the right to vote, the state of Virginia, because they just went all blue, they're going to probably likely to vote for it. And we're only 2 or 3 states away in terms of have the right for ERA to pass in your lifetime. In your lifetime. And if that happens, what do you want to do with it in terms of that could be the potential? And you're sitting here, 18 to 35-year-olds, the 70s here in the room, but we're going to be a part of that conversation in our lifetime and thinking about what that could do as well. So that's why I think if you can hang on to this packet, and I don't know if anyone's interested, anyone doing law or anything interested in the law or any kind of like, oh, there you are. And I'm just trying to, yeah, and I'm trying to think about how that could make a change, but also not only legally, it's also people in like health clinics, other advocates in which you can feel like you can be like an ally and part of what you can do with this in terms of the right to vote. One more, and then I want to kind of move on. Where's my clock?
It's 4:46.
All right. And it all ties in together, but again, it's like a continuum about what this does. Does anyone speak more than one language in this room? All right, what language do you speak? Spanish, what else? Going around, who else? What?
Farsi.
Oh, good. And?
Swedish and German.
Swedish and anyone else? Oh, wow, good. Okay, I was not thinking about that. I only raise that because has anyone ever been in a situation in which you intentionally go into a space and you're the only one who doesn't know how to speak Spanish? And what that feels like and what that means? And it's not no shade, but it's almost like where are we showing up in spaces? And if there's an intentionality of wanting to be intersectional, then I would think those of you who know how to do bilingual, you're an amazing resource. Because you could be the person that says, I will sit in this meeting and come with you and have that conversation so we can all be a part of that conversation, no one gets left out. But also, what about learning it and teaching it? And I'm just trying to think, in Spanish, whatever the other language might be. But here's another moment, because these conversations are happening right now. Demographically, in the state of North Carolina right now, I would say, well, the state of North Carolina is majority women, literally right now. But there's an ever-growing Latina community, city, rural, and they're trying to figure out how they have conversations. So they intentionally, like the Highlander Center, everything is in Spanish and English automatically. Automatically, you just do it because you know that's the right thing to do. But it makes a difference because I want to know if I'm welcome here, but I know I can't be here if I can't even read it, hear it, understand it. So there again, that's a very, in my opinion, a very amazing opportunity to be engaged in those conversations and bring other communities in. And also culturally, what are you talking about? And do you have the right to vote or don't you have the right to vote? How you can talk about language justice or food justice in a language we can all understand. So the fact that you know how to speak that, and then those of us who don't, can we learn? Can we know how that works? And can we intentionally put things in English and Spanish? And what other languages it might be depending on where you are in terms of what you might do for making that change. Don't mourn, organize. If there's a need, fill it. And thinking about where we're going forward. And the final thing I'll just wrap up on, I guess, and I'm being honest about this. I had told this to Stella and some other people, Randy, when I was at your house with you and Betsy. I feel even at the age of 71, I'm still on a journey. I don't know all the answers. I'm not sure we know everything. But I want to know how we could do a collective we as we continue where we're going, however that might be organized, and having conversation and strategizing and getting back to that idea about the quality of life and what you believe in and what are the values and principles, however you decide to go forward in terms of the work that you do. And one of the most recent things that was pretty upsetting to me, thinking about campuses and what happens, that we have these monuments down in a lot of these schools in the South. That's just part of what the schools are. And there had been this amazing effort, you might have been hearing about it, about taking the monuments down or covering them over or moving them. And then thinking about, why do we have 11 historically black colleges in North Carolina? Because of segregation, you had to create your own campuses. There are 110 historically black colleges and universities in this country, the majority in the South. So they form their own in terms of how you make that possible. But now the conversation is, can then we be all of us, race, class, culture, wherever it might be, collectively, where we are, how we're making change, can we get in the same space, figure out what we're going to do, what the conversation can be, and what's the role that we have to play in that? Because demographics are shifting. By 2050, if not sooner, this country will be majority people, and don't use the word minority, it will be majority people of color. By 2050, will be majority people of color and the numbers of women. So when you think about women didn't have the right, people of color, and where we are now, what do we do with that moving forward? How do we collectively have that conversation? And I want to have it with you. And I want to know if I can struggle with you around this. I want to know if there's some plans and ideas that we can literally put in paper and or organize in terms of how we go forward. And then the census is coming up in 2020. There's an election. I mean, we're at this amazing moment in terms of all these historical moments, what's coming down the path, what you're all going to do with your lives and what you want to do with it. And can we be in some kind of a communication conversation with each other about it? And I just feel humbled that I can kind of talk a little bit about with you. So that's kind of the big picture things that I'm thinking about right now in terms of a few of the items that I have. I'll go home tomorrow and I'll be fully engaged, as I has been, going into 2020. We'll stay engaged with the Resistance Studies Initiative. And then maybe, depending on what y'all want to do up here, and what happens here as well, connecting, kind of being in partnership, how we proceed gaily forward. Work? Good. All right. So can we take a little pause for the moment, and then we're going to maybe think about Q&A. We have a couple of people who have some things to start. But I really would encourage you, if you have anything you want to say, or here's this question I never thought about, it's really open. I mean, I really encourage you to share. And if you don't, that's okay, not a problem. But I think it's a great time to just start having some conversation. And when does the school year get out here? When is everyone going home for the holidays?
December 12th.
And when?
December 12th.
Yeah, so that's just like almost 2 weeks ago. So this is our last chance maybe to see y'all. And the graduating seniors, good luck. I think it's going to hope you have that. And everyone coming back, I appreciate it. So I'll stop there, and I'm going to stop the recording. And then we're just going to open it up a little bit and have a little bit of a conversation. Sound good? We all right? Good? All right?
Thank you.